Caliban and the Witch. Section. Capitalist accumulation and the accumulation of labor in Europe. Capital, Marx wrote, comes on the face of the earth dripping blood and dirt from head to toe. And indeed, when we look at the beginning of capitalist development, we have the impression of being in an immense concentration camp. In the, quote, New World, we have the subjugation of the aboriginal population to the regimes of the Mita and Quatachil, under which multitudes of people were consumed to bring silver and mercury to the surface in the mines of Huancavelica and Potosi. Footnote. For a description of the systems of the Encomienda, Mita, and Cataquil, see, among others, Andre Gunder Frank, Steve J. Stern, and Inga Clendinen. As described by Gunder Frank, the Encomienda was, quote, a system under which rights to the labor of the Indian communities were granted to Spanish landowners. But in 1548, the Spaniards, quote, began to replace the Encomienda de Servido by the Repartimiento, called Cataquil in Mexico and Mita in Peru, which required the Indian communities' chiefs to supply the Spanish juez repartidor, distributing judge, with a certain number of days of labor per month. The Spanish official, in turn, distributed this supply of labor to qualified enterprising labor contractors, who were supposed to pay the laborers a certain minimum wage. End quote. On the efforts of the Spaniards to bind labor in Mexico and Peru in the course of the various stages of colonization, and the impact on it of the catastrophic collapse of the indigenous population, see again Gunder Frank. End of footnote. In Eastern Europe, we have a, quote, second serfdom, tying to the land a population of farmers who had never previously been enserfed. Footnote. For a discussion of the, quote, second serfdom, see Emanuel Wallerstein and Henry Kamen. It is important here to stress that the newly enserfed peasants were now producing for the international grain market. In other words, despite the seeming backward character of the work relation imposed upon them, under the new regime, they were an integral part of a developing capitalist economy, an international capitalist division of labor. End footnote. In Western Europe, we have the enclosures, the witch hunt, the branding, whipping, and incarceration of vagabonds and beggars in newly constructed workhouses and correction houses, models for the future prison system. On the horizon, we have the rise of the slave trade, while on the seas, ships are already transporting indentured servants and convicts from Europe to America. What we deduce from this scenario is that force was the main lever, the main economic power in the process of primitive accumulation. Because capitalist development required an immense leap in the wealth appropriated by the European ruling class and the number of workers brought under its command. Footnote. I am echoing here Marx's statement in Capital Volume 1, quote, force is in itself an economic power. Far less convincing is Marx's accompanying observation, according to which, quote, force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one, end quote. First, midwives bring life into the world, not destruction. This metaphor also suggests that capitalism, quote, evolved out of forces gestating in the bosom of the feudal world, an assumption which Marx himself refutes in his discussion of primitive accumulation. Comparing force to the generative powers of a midwife also casts a benign veil over the process of capital accumulation, suggesting necessity, inevitability, and ultimately progress. End footnote. In other words, primitive accumulation consisted in an immense accumulation of labor power, quote, dead labor, in the form of stolen goods, and, quote, living labor, in the form of human beings made available for exploitation, realized on a scale never before matched in the course of history. Significantly, the tendency of the capitalist class during the first 3 centuries of its existence was to impose slavery and other forms of coerced labor as the dominant work relation, a tendency limited only by the workers' resistance and the danger of the exhaustion of the workforce. This was true not only in the American colonies, where, by the 16th century, economies based on coerced labor were forming, but in Europe as well. Later, I examine the importance of slave labor and the plantation system in capitalist accumulation. Here, I want to stress that in Europe, too, in the 15th century, slavery was never completely abolished, and it was revitalized. Footnote. Slavery had never been abolished in Europe, surviving in pockets, mostly as female domestic slavery. But by the end of the 15th century, slaves again began to be imported, by the Portuguese, from Africa. Attempts to impose slavery continued in England through the 16th century, resulting, after the introduction of public relief, in the construction of workhouses and correction houses, which England pioneered in Europe. End of footnote. As reported by the Italian historian Salvatore Bono, to whom we owe the most extensive study of slavery in Italy, there were numerous slaves in the Mediterranean areas in the 16th and 17th centuries, and their numbers grew after the Battle of Lepanto, 1571, that escalated the hostilities against the Muslim world. Bono calculates that more than 10,000 slaves lived in Naples and 25,000 in the Neapolitan kingdom as a whole, 1% of the population. And similar figures apply to other Italian towns and to southern France. In Italy, a system of public slavery developed whereby thousands of kidnapped foreigners, the ancestors of today's undocumented immigrant workers, were employed by city governments for public works, or were farmed out to private citizens who employed them in agriculture. Many were destined for the oars, an important source of such employment being the Vatican fleet. Slavery is, quote, that form of exploitation towards which the master always strives. Europe was no exception. This must be emphasized to dispel the assumption of a special connection between slavery and Africa. Footnote. See, on this point, Samir Amin. To stress the existence of European slavery in the 16th and 17th centuries, and after, is also important because this fact has often been, quote, forgotten by European historians. According to Salvatore Bono, this self-induced oblivion was a product of the, quote, scramble for Africa, which was justified as a mission aimed to terminate slavery on the African continent. Bono argues that Europe's elites could not admit to having employed slaves in Europe, the alleged cradle of democracy. End of footnote. But in Europe, slavery remained a limited phenomenon, as the material conditions for it did not exist, although the employer's desires for it must have been quite strong if it took until the 18th century before slavery was outlawed in England. The attempt to bring back serfdom failed as well, except in the East, where population scarcity gave landlords the upper hand. Footnote. See Emanuel Wallerstein. End footnote. In the West, its restoration was prevented by peasant resistance, culminating in the, quote, German Peasant War. A broad organizational effort spreading over 3 countries, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and joining workers from every field, farmers, miners, artisans, the best German and Austrian artists. This, quote, revolution of the common man was a watershed in European history. Footnote. Paolo Thea has powerfully reconstructed the history of the German artists who sided with the peasants. Quote, during the Protestant Reformation, some among the best 16th century German artists abandoned their laboratories to join the peasants in struggle. They drafted documents inspired by the principles of evangelic poverty, the common sharing of goods, and the redistribution of wealth. Sometimes they took arms in support of the cause. The endless list of those who, after the military defeats of May to June 1525, met the rigors of the penal code, mercilessly applied by the winners against the vanquished, includes famous names. Among them are George Ratget, quartered in Pforzheim, Stuttgart, Philipp Dietmann, beheaded, and Tilman Riemenschneider, mutilated, both in Würzburg. Matthias Grunwald, chased from the court of Magonza where he worked. Holbein the Young was so troubled by the events that he fled from Basel, a city that was torn apart by religious conflict. End quote. Also in Switzerland, Austria, and the Tyrol Artists participated in the peasant war, including famous ones like Lucas Cranach the Old, as well as myriad lesser painters and engravers. Thea points out that the deeply felt participation of the artists to the cause of the peasants is also demonstrated by the revaluation of rural themes depicting peasant life, dancing peasants, animals, and flora in contemporary 16th century German art. Quote, "The countryside had become animated. It had acquired in the uprising a personality worthy of being represented." End quote, and end of footnote. Like the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, it shook the powerful to the core, merging in their consciousness with the Anabaptist takeover of Munster, which confirmed their fears that an international conspiracy was underway to overthrow their power. Footnote. It was through the prism of the Peasant War and Anabaptism that the European governments, through the 16th and 17th centuries, interpreted and repressed every form of social protest. The echoes of the Anabaptist Revolution were felt in Elizabethan England and in France, inspiring utmost vigilance and severity with regard to any challenge to the constituted authority. Quote, "Anabaptist" became a cursed word, a sign of opprobrium and criminal intent, as, quote, "communist" was in the United States in the 1950s, and, quote, "terrorist" is today. Early 17th century German engraving reviling the Anabaptists' belief in the communistic sharing of goods. End of footnote. After its defeat, which occurred in the same year as the conquest of Peru, and which was commemorated by Albrecht Dürer with the, quote, "monument to the vanquished peasants," the revenge was merciless. Quote, "Thousands of corpses laid on the ground from Thuringia to Alsace, in the fields, in the woods, in the ditches of 1,000 dismantled, burned castles. Murdered, tortured, impaled, martyred." End quote. But the clock could not be turned back. In various parts of Germany and the other territories that had been at the center of the war, customary rights and even forms of territorial government were preserved. Footnote. Village authority and privileges were maintained in the hinterland of some city-states. In a number of territorial states, the peasants, quote, "continued to refuse dues, taxes, and labor services." Quote, "They let me yell and give me nothing," complained the abbot of Schussenried, referring to those working on his land. In Upper Swabia, southwest Germany, though serfdom was not abolished, some of the main peasant grievances relating to inheritance and marriage rights were accepted with the Treaty of Memmingen of 1526. Quote, "On the Upper Rhine, too, some areas reached settlements that were positive for the peasants." End quote. In Switzerland, in Bern, and Zurich, serfdom was abolished. Improvements in the lot of the common man were negotiated in Tyrol and Salzburg. But, quote, "the true child of the revolution" was the Territorial Assembly, instituted after 1525 in Upper Swabia, providing the foundation for a system of self-government that remained in place till the 19th century. New territorial assemblies emerged after 1525. Quote, "Realizing, in a weakened form, one of the demands of 1525, that the common man ought to be part of the territorial estates alongside the nobles, the clergy, and the towns." End quote. Blickel concludes that, quote, "Wherever this cause won out, we cannot say that there the lords crowned their military conquest with political victory, as the prince was still bound to the consent of the common man. Only later, during the formation of the absolute state, did the prince succeed in freeing himself from that consent." End of quote and end of footnote. Picture: peasant unfurling the banner of freedom. This was an exception, where workers' resistance to reinsertment could not be broken. The response was the expropriation of the peasantry from its land and the introduction of forced wage labor. Workers attempting to hire themselves out independently or leave their employers were punished with incarceration and even with death in the case of recidivism. A, quote, free wage labor market did not develop in Europe until the 18th century. And even then, contractual wage work was obtained only at the price of an intense struggle, and by a limited set of laborers, mostly male and adult. Nevertheless, the fact that slavery and serfdom could not be restored meant that the labor crisis that had characterized the late Middle Ages continued in Europe into the 17th century, aggravated by the fact that the drive to maximize the exploitation of labor put in jeopardy the reproduction of the workforce. This contradiction, which still characterizes capitalist development, exploded most dramatically in the American colonies, where work, disease, and disciplinary punishments destroyed 2/3 of the Native American population in the decades immediately after the conquest. Footnote 1. Referring to the growing pauperization brought about across the world by capitalist development, the French anthropologist Claude Meillassoux, in Maidens, Meal, and Money, has argued that this contradiction spells a future crisis for capitalism. Quote, in the end, imperialism, as a means of reproducing cheap labor power, is leading capitalism to a major crisis. For even if there are still millions of people in the world, not directly involved in capitalist employment, how many are still capable, owing to the social disruption, famine, and wars it brings about, of producing their own subsistence and feeding their children? End of footnote 1. Footnote 2. The extent of the demographic catastrophe caused by, quote, the Columbian Exchange is still debated. Estimates of the population decline in South and Central America in the first post-Columbian century range widely, but contemporary scholarly opinion is almost unanimous in likening its effects to an American Holocaust. André Gunder-Frank writes that, quote, within little more than a century, the Indian population declined by 90%, and even 95% in Mexico, Peru, and some other regions. End quote. Similarly, Noble David Cook argues that, quote, perhaps 9 million people resided within the limits delineated by Peru's contemporary boundaries. The number of inhabitants remaining a century after contact was roughly 1/10 of those that were there when the Europeans invaded the Andean world. End quote. And end of footnote. It was also at the core of the slave trade and the exploitation of slave labor. Millions of Africans died because of the torturous living conditions to which they were subjected during the Middle Passage and on the plantations. Never in Europe did the exploitation of the workforce reach such genocidal proportions, except under the Nazi regime. Even so, there too, in the 16th and 17th centuries, land privatization and the commodification of social relations, the response of lords and merchants to their economic crisis, caused widespread poverty, mortality, and an intense resistance that threatened to shipwreck the emerging capitalist economy. This, I argue, is the historical context in which the history of women and reproduction in the transition from feudalism to capitalism must be placed, for the changes which the advent of capitalism introduced in the social position of women, especially at the proletarian level, whether in Europe or America, were primarily dictated by the search for new sources of labor, as well as new forms of regimentation and division of the workforce. Picture: Albrecht Dürer, Monument to the Vanquished Peasants, 1526. This picture, representing a peasant enthroned on a collection of objects from his daily life, is highly ambiguous. It can suggest that the peasants were betrayed, or that they themselves should be treated as traitors. Accordingly, it has been interpreted as either a satire of the rebel peasants, or as an homage to their moral strength. What we know with certainty is that Dürer was profoundly perturbed by the events of 1525, and, as a convinced Lutheran, must have followed Luther in his condemnation of the revolt. End of caption. In support of this statement, I trace the main developments that shaped the advent of capitalism in Europe, land privatization and the price revolution, to argue that neither was sufficient to produce a self-sustaining process of proletarianization. I then examine in broad outlines the policies which the capitalist class introduced to discipline, reproduce, and expand the European proletariat, beginning with the attack it launched on women, resulting in the construction of a new patriarchal order, which I define as the, quote, patriarchy of the wage. Lastly, I look at the production of racial and sexual hierarchies in the colonies, asking to what extent they could form a terrain of confrontation or solidarity between indigenous, African, and European women and between women and men. End of section.